been making an invitation to transgress, to leave behind those models. And nowadays, we are being like invited to assume, for example, a more, let's say, context-sensitive dynamic, a more, let's say, context like conscious perspective. And that is why we are going to talk about English as a lingua franca and global Englishes. So there is a situation taking place in applied linguistics and in linguistics applied to the teaching and learning of English. Whereas in previous years, there was a very heavy focus on linguistic, like, let's say, pedagogies and linguistic only oriented, like, let's say, lessons. That was like the idea of teaching grammar, teaching vocabulary, teaching, for example, listening, improving, for example, writing, and these ideas, which is not something like negative. In the last few years, many people have begun to notice that there is also something taking place in academia and in different contexts. And the issue is that English is being, like, let's say, influenced by local languages and vice versa. Our local languages are also like influencing English in many different ways. So ELT in Colombia, it's a good example of what is happening in academia nowadays. In Colombia, there is a big association of teachers. For instance, if we begin to see the articles, if we begin to see the styles, the contributions, we can notice like a trend. And the trend is that we are making efforts to begin to talk about, for example, unity in academia. We are also making efforts to talk about, for example, Colombian English. We are also making efforts to talk about, for example, materials and material design from a different perspective. So basically, in Colombia and in Latin America and in different places of the world, academia is going against those traditional established materials, pedagogies, and let's say like views that for many years have like been predominant in the field. So what is happening? English as a lingua franca is one of these, let's say, lenses that is gaining first momentum traction in academia in the 21st century. There is something also very interesting taking place. In previous years, English was like, let's say, the language of the native people. So people from the US, people from the UK, people from Canada, people from Australia, they were perceived, they were seen like the legitimate speakers of the language. Nowadays, and according to CRISTA 2012, and according to the Grado, we non-native people, we have outnumbered native speakers. So if we have one non-native person, if we have one native person, we have four non-native people. So we have outnumbered this quantity of speakers, and as such, we are also claiming legitimacy of the language because we are also influencing the way language is being used in the world. So what is happening in Colombia and potentially in many places is that academics, scholars, investigators, researchers, teachers, educators, ELT professionals, they have begun to notice that it's also necessary to begin to talk about the particularities of the context in which English teaching and learning takes place. So what happened more or less in the year 1992? Professor Brackashew and Professor Larry Smith, they began to analyze the situation of English in the world, and they came to the conclusion that it could be divided into three different life circles, let's say. This is the famous Krashews or Krashewian three circles model. The first circle is the inner circle. According to Krashew, this is the English characterized by native communities. So, for instance, the United States, people from the UK, this kind of like speech communities, let's say. He also said that we have the other circle that is nations that were former British colonies. For example, India, Nigeria, for example, the Philippines, for example, Singapore, because it's very often that in these nations, countries, English holds an official status. And finally, we have the expanding circle that is Colombia, for example, that is Ecuador, for example, that is, let's say, Poland, for example, Russia, for example, and many other countries. English is not like the native language and doesn't achieve that status, but still is used in academic context and in kind of like, let's say, pedagogical spaces. So what is happening? In the last few years, English as a lingua franca, English as an international language, English as an international lingua franca, world Englishes and global Englishes, they are kind of like different, but at the same time, they are very convergent. They have been like gaining momentum, traction, as I said, so a sense of importance. So many people have begun to wonder if we need to continue teaching ELT or English, applying ELT or teaching English as we have been doing it for many years. So what has been the focus? Okay, to achieve native like proficiency. But if we are not native people, is it possible? Is there namely, let's say, like native like proficiency or not really? So in the last few years, specifically in the last 2 decades, different scholars such as Su, Macias 2010, Mosquera Perez, myself 2022, Mora 2022, we have been wondering if we should teach about English as a lingua franca or global Englishes. So there is a kind of like interesting situation taking place because in different contexts, people use different terms. For example, in Colombia, people say sometimes English is a lingua franca. The, let's say, established typical term in terms of semantics is English as a foreign language. Even in Ecuador, it's English as a foreign language, and in many other countries. If, for instance, I travel to teach English to the United States, I'm going to be an English as a second language because that is the native language. So when people leave the classes, when people go to different contexts, they are going to have different, like, let's say, spaces using the language. But in Colombia, in the time being, we are talking about English as a foreign language. So there is a situation. Many people have said, specifically, Mora 2022 concluded, mentioned, said that the term foreign is somehow like problematic because foreign etymologically speaking means like strange, like weird, like deficient, let's say. So we should stop like labeling English as a foreign language in Colombia. And in 2022, Mora said, Raúl Alberto Mora said that we should begin to talk about Colombian English or English as a Colombian language. 12 years ago in 2010, Macias, in the southern like region of the country, began to talk about English as a lingua franca. But even in academia itself, there is a kind of like contradiction in the way we use the terms. So in the first years, scholars, academic, like people began to talk about English as a lingua franca as a means to refer to interaction between non-native people. For example, a person from Colombia and a person from let's say, France speaking in English. So that was like the main scope in the initial years, stages. Later, people began to say that English was an international language because people did not only use English with natives, but also with non-natives. So it was a combination of the two. In the year 2015, Jennifer Jenkins, the mother of English as a lingua franca, she began to say that English as a lingua franca is that kind of interaction that we have through English that is not, doesn't have like a possible description. So English as a lingua franca may entail, for example, interaction between native people, non-native people, and native people, and also between non-native people and non-native people at the same time, and also including like speech communities from the different criteria circles, having to do, for example, with the inner, with the outer, and with the spanning circle. So in academia, there is a very interesting push because in terms of semantics, there is no consensus. So some people talk about English as a lingua franca, other people talk about English as an international language, other people talk about world Englishes, and other people talk about global Englishes. It demonstrates like the richness of the field knowledge, let's say. But in this presentation, we are talking about English as a lingua franca and global Englishes as a means to, as an action to try to unite, let's say, to try to fill the gap between praxis and also between theory in the field. So, what happens? So nowadays there is a kind of like push, let's say, and some scholars from the global south, from Colombia, from other like Latin American countries, they are actively inviting people to begin to talk about English as a lingua franca. But many studies have kind of like shown too that when people are engaged with English as a lingua franca interaction or with global English interaction, it's very likely that you're going to encounter two possible situations. On the one hand, people are going to be very open, people are going to be very receptive, people are going to be kind of happy because they get recognized as legitimate users of the language. And on the other hand, you have the other situation that people begin to have ideological conflicts because they don't know to what kind of like English they're. Should I use, for example, American English, if so exists? Should I use, for example, let's say, British English, if so exists? Because even in the United Kingdom, even in the United States, we can encounter many dialects when talking about English. So what is happening? This is like an invitation. This is not like an universal truth. We are not trying to reinvent the wheel. We are not trying to fully like change the field because we are also talking about critical pedagogy. We are also talking about the coloniality. And if, for example, there is something like very pre-established, and we, for example, disrupt American English and begin to talk about, for example, African English, just African English, we are like pursuing, we are like repeating those colonialist patterns that have for many years taking place in the field. So English as a lingua franca, global Englishes, although they are kind of like different, they are convergent in the sense that they are making an invitation to begin to recognize the identities, the particularities, the contexts, the communities, the social issues, for example, the cultural markers or characteristics taking place when people talk about English teaching and learning. And these terms, as I just said, they are kind of like divergent and convergent at the same time because there is no consensus in academia. So in the initial stages, English as a lingua franca, as I said some minutes ago, was mainly connected to interaction, spaces of interaction between non-native people. Later in the year 2015, Jennifer Jenkins, that was the person that developed the line of English as a lingua franca in research, she said, no, it cannot be described. So English as a lingua franca is everything and anything having to do with English. Later, we also have the concept of English as an international language. We also have What English is that was created by Professor Brakashu, the guy that designed the three circles like model, and also Professor Larry Smith. And we also have global Englishes, and we finally have GELS, that is global English language teaching. So what is happening with this? In the year 2000, country, she published an article, and the article had to do with this like compilation of terms and this analysis underlying these issues. And she came to the conclusion that we should talk about global English as language teaching because whereas, for example, What English allows talking about French English, German English, Ecuadorian English, Colombian English, for instance, American English, British English, Indian English, or English, or Korean English, or Konglish. Global English as language teaching tries to make an effort to unify like theory and practice at the same time in ELT and TESOL fields, let's say. So at the level of literature, we have kind of like a kind of like a number of, let's say, research studies having to do with these fields. So one was produced by Professor McCabe, Sedelhofer, and these other guys. Another one was produced by Room 2012. Another one was published in Japan. It like gave an account of let's say pedagogical like intervention that took place in the same by Galloway and Rose 2018. And these people began to notice that when people are kind of like exposed to what Englishes or global Englishes or English as a lingua franca like pedagogies, people begin to have a different conception of English. So they begin to notice that they are also valid speakers, that they should also have a voice, let's say, in academia, that their English also matters, even if their English kinds of like deviate from standard English, because the textbooks, the materials, the resources, pedagogies, the approaches, the methods, the strategies have for many years kind of like disregarded these particularities in English teaching and learning takes place worldwide. So now my peer, Nicolás, is going to proceed with the presentation.
Yeah, good afternoon. So why teaching from a global English perspective, or why teaching under this why teaching under a global English language teaching view? So basically here, what Macias 2010 says is that we have to bear in mind three different points or three different aspects if we want to integrate English as a lingua franca in Colombia. But I don't think that this can only happen in Colombia, but in other countries that do not speak English as their native language. So the first aspect is the relationship between native English speaking teachers and non-native English speaking teachers. So for many decades, many scholars, many people have the thought that native speakers, I'm referring to the English native speakers, are better at teaching just by the fact that they are native. However, as we can see, Bantam 1990 asserts being born into a social group does not mean that you can speak a language well. So there are many native speakers who cannot write, yeah, there are many non-native speakers who can write because in some way non-native speakers have studied, have learned the language, yeah, and also from a pedagogical perspective. So many times, native speakers do not receive like this kind of pedagogical training that that non-native do receive. So we have another aspect here is that many native English speaking teachers are monolingual. What does it mean? What does it imply? That they haven't experienced by firsthand what does it feel to learn foreign language. So in some ways, like a barrier between teacher and students when it comes to the fact or to the act of teaching. We have the second one that is about that image. We have the A1, A2, and all the levels that you can imagine. So now all like this is of course referring to the Common European Framework reference. Where was it designed? In a country that belonged to the inner circle, countries that speak English as their native language. And something that happens here as it was developed in another country, So the context, the needs were from another country. So as we can say, Macia 2010 says initiatives to design local or national methodologies in Colombia have been kept to a minimum or have been quickly absorbed by the international English language teaching market, something that happens in Colombia. How many proposals of national methodology we have? Yeah, at least the methodologies that are being implemented at schools are the methodologies that are brought from the outside. And finally, we have the materials, creation of materials. So what culture is exposed in the English? Normally, and the culture that is exposed is the culture of those countries that are part of the inner circle. And it's something normally. Why? Why is it normal? It's normal because they were at some point the owners of the language. They were considered the owners of the language. So they were also responsible of making this kind of material. However, if we keep practicing or we keep teaching through these materials without considering our national context, we are just promoting the idea of colonialism of power, colonialism of being and knowledge. Because at some point, students are going to compare their culture with the other that they are seeing illustrated in the books, and they say, okay, maybe I want to be like them. Maybe I want to sound like them. Yeah. So in some way they are comparing their culture, and they will actually many people can think that they want to be in another country as they consider other culture better than their own culture. In the next slide, we have that the rationale for global English language teaching. There are just like some reasons for having this perspective of the English language. We have first increasing globalization. So around the globe, there are many debates going on science, business, culture, and technology. What does this have has as a particularity? That the English language is being used as a means of communication or being used as a lingua franca. So the idea is that English learners can join this debate, this discussion from different contexts, from different parts of the world, with different perspectives. Then we have linguistic diversity, that is basically about global Englishes. That global Englishes give us the opportunity to recognize different variations or varieties of English, as would be the case, for instance, of the Indian English, that is not part of the inner circle, is a country that belongs to the outer circle. Then we have focus on communicative competence. Normally, native speaker norms are like about a year. So English learners avoid or quit learning or taking, for instance, the English class as they don't like this kind of norms. Or we have that by teaching real world context, we can have more engaging materials so that students are not going to drop out. We have finally that by doing so, we can enhance the intercultural competence. What is the intercultural competence? Intercultural competence is a way of understanding between cultures with, of course, respect. And this by the cultural awareness and sensitivity. Finally, we have preparation for real world interactions. As English becomes a lingua franca, more and more scenarios are going to be spoken in English, or the means of communication is going to be English. For instance, the video games. So many people from different countries are playing the same video game, but they are using different types or varieties of English, but they have the same purpose. So if we expose our students to different varieties of Englishes, they're going to enhance their communicative competence and they are going to understand that the English language is used in different ways. So now let's analyze some excerpts that are brought from the work of Macias and Mosquera 2024 and ongoing research by the same authors. So first we have that Macias and Mosquera 2024 reported in their article titled English as a Lingua Franca, World Englishes, and the Preparation of Language Teachers and Awareness Raising Experience in an English Teacher Preparation Program in Colombia, that by this exposure to different varieties of English, they could get some categories. So the first one is developing new perspective and understandings. So this is just some excerpts that they could get from this intervention. So first was a way of deconstruct the idea that we have to sound as a native speaker. Yeah. And that was mentioned by one of the participants. We have also For instance, the case of Jose, who tried, or his dream was to sound as a British speaker. Something that are like, there are goals that cannot be that are not achievable in some way. So by being exposed to different varieties of English, they understand that the accent itself, it depends on the region, and it's also part of the identity of someone. Yeah. So in some way, he understood that this recognition of languages give him like more voice. Yeah, in some way. And after being exposed to different cultures, different Englishes, different varieties of Englishes, as it was stated by Maria, teachers should clarify that these varieties are also correct in English, because sometimes we make mock of different types of Englishes because we consider that these are not real versions of the English language. Yeah, they are incorrect in some way. That's what we consider. However, it had been shaped by their L1. Yeah, so there are just variations of English, but are also considered correct. So, in short, implementing the presentation strategy helped the participants gain new viewpoints and perspective with regard to dominant English varieties, and contributed to the acceptance and recognitions of new emerging Englishes. So, the next slide, we have that there was a new category that was contributing to teacher professional development. So after this reflection, after understanding these points of view, this after being exposed to these varieties of English, they understood that by doing things, by exposing their students to different varieties of English, they could first get more motivation of learning English, since they don't have this barrier that they have to sound as a native speaker to have a valid English. Moreover, that these linguistic boundaries that we have at English are not actually boundaries, but we have now more like an open mind of the varieties of English. And finally, that the English as a lingua franca or global Englishes give us the opportunity to teach English through different cultures, as it would be the case of St. Patrick's Day, that normally related to the American culture. However, its roots are began in Ireland, so we can teach Irish, yeah, through the English language. So the above comments show that participants began to think to concrete ways to incorporate aspects of word English as a lingua franca paradigm in their current and future teaching practices.
Positioning as equal skilled users of English, we have Jose and Maria and a brief conclusion of this article. Okay, Jose was an English teacher of a private institution in
Add in the
Colombia.
volume,
And
please.
I'm not sure if Karen is talking, but her microphone doesn't work. We can hear you, Karen.
can't
No.
now.
Yeah, now.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
It works.
so I will start again.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. To continue with the same discussion of positioning as equal skilled users of English, we will talk about Jose and Maria and like a brief conclusion of this article. Okay, so Jose, as an English teacher of a private institution, he taught to English adult learners. And Jose was similarly able to debunk prior expectations in terms of aiming or pretending a native like accent in English or demanding this from his students. So, in reference to his group of students, he mentioned that he heard them saying, like, I can't speak in English, or that pronunciation is too difficult, I'm too old for that. So, to tackle this situation, he explained that he showed certain videos of different English accents, and he told them, or he told to his students, that they were comfortable, the speakers were comfortable with what they were saying, and they didn't sound like native speakers or like the characters in the listening activities that they used to do. So, in other words, like the great majority of the participants showed that the showing varieties of English to their students could empower them to be more confident users of English and like to overcome feelings of embarrassment and helplessness that because they may believe that they were not allowed to really own the language because they didn't sound like native speakers. So, taking into account the little bit that we know a little bit about other cultures and users of English, Andrea and other participants reflected that sometimes we tend to reflect a lot upon the norms and condemn those people who speak different. And when the most important thing here is the communication. So at the end of this project, or at the end of this research, 20 out of 22 participants demonstrated are that they have appreciated their own culture and accent as a result of contemplating someone else's culture and like pronunciation, the way you speak. So acknowledging the relevance of the varieties of English and understanding that each user of English has his or her own identity. So in the next slide, we will talk about other article, which is an ongoing study entitled Examining Teachers, Educators, and Pre-Service Teachers' Sense of Awareness and Perceived Implication of English as a Lingua Franca in an English Teacher Education program at a public university in Colombia. This is, as I mentioned before, an ongoing process by Macias and Mosquera Perez. So they have concluded a series of issues that must be reflected in order to fully move to either English as a lingua franca or to a global English language teaching view. So they describe like three main issues, and those are the ones that I'm going to talk right now. So, breaking away from a dominant orthodoxy. English as a lingua franca can help us, teachers and students, to move away from the perspective and common belief that native speaker, mostly North American and British speakers, set the only valid standards for learning English. So there is an urgent need to challenge or to change that idea that native speakerism or like standard English should always be the goal when learning English. So there are still many in-service in pre-service teachers that consider that on the other hand, people often view that or consider North American and English, right, like British English, as the default or proper forms of English, which create a narrow mindset and can be like this attitude can lead to a kind of mythicism of English, making many people consider that other versions of the language are wrong or less valuable. And as a consequence of, or as a result, communities may think that variation of English that are not British or North American English are somehow inferior. Like in the other slide, we have the other issue that is progressive acceptance and awareness of English language teaching in teacher education. So even though that a lot of like teacher educators have faced a lot of obstacles from the government institutions or their schools, some of them have found the effective ways to introduce English as a lingua franca. So thanks to these efforts, students, teachers are slowly taking into account and accepting English as a lingua franca. This helps them to better understand how English works in different parts of the world. As an example of this can be the English teacher may reproduce a listening exercise with Irish, German, and Indian user of the language. It must necessarily.
Hola, ¿qué tal amigos de YouTube? Bienvenidos a la 23ª parte del curso de programación en Java. El día de hoy vamos a
teaching and intercultural competence has helped the students to go beyond the idealized concept of native English speaker. So those courses provide a broader perspective of English and highlight the diverse uses and cultural influences that shape the language. And those have helped or have led to a nuanced understanding of the situation of English around the world. Another issue here is that Macias and Mosquera Perez 2024 indicate that pedagogical interventions on English as a lingua franca in the world English awareness can help future teachers to develop new perspectives and understanding of English. Those pedagogical interventions support their pedagogical support and professional growth and can help them to feel more confident and proud of their identity as non-native English speakers. In the following slide, we have the last the last part that is entitled concrete actions and strategies. Okay, so here teachers, educators emphasize in the importance of developing students' awareness of English and English as a lingua franca. How? By exposing them to various English accents and varieties. This exposure helps the students to understand the diversity of English worldwide and prepares them to embrace different cultures and in different contexts in the English teaching process. Not only again the North American and the British culture. Another essential point is that it's important to update the program's curriculum and align it with modern perspectives and viewpoints related to English as a lingua franca. However, it should be introduced in the latest stages of the program to prevent misunderstanding between students. Also, English teacher educators and the student teachers highlighted the importance, the need for materials that are responsive to English as a lingua franca, suggesting that current materials reflect most of the time native speaker varieties and don't adequately represent the diversity of English around the world. Other important aspect is that teachers face institutional barriers like lack of time and lack of support, which are likely to create obstacles in their ability to design English as a lingua franca material and pedagogy. So, an effective integration of English as a lingua franca into education requires an international support and professional development. So, English as a lingua franca material development, English as a lingua franca is one of the issues that has gained importance in regard to English language teaching. Here we are going to show like a brief example of this, as is like this is an explanation of how the materials are created. Like this is a description of the person who is speaking and different regions of the world. So as we can consider, it's important to start talking about English as a lingua franca in classes, and those are examples of how those can be gathered. In the next slide, we can see an English from like in Oceania and Africa. And in the following slide, we have a text that explains Indian culture and how English can be like how world English is. How English as a lingua franca can be like gathered in the materials for teaching English. And we have some conclusions. The first one is courses like globalization and language teaching are valuable because they help participants to rethink and reconsider dominant English varieties, highlighting the importance of English as a lingua franca and and world Englishes. And other important aspect is that Colombia has traditionally prioritized standardized English, reinforcing the dominant ideologies that exclude individuals who don't conform Anglo-European norms. Another conclusion is that programs focusing on English as a lingua franca and world Englishes can empower people from the expanding circle countries like Colombia
Colaborar es esencial.
to feel more validated in the use of English and challenge those beliefs that can be like harmful, like native speakerism. And the other conclusion is that there is an urgent demand for teaching materials that address English as a lingua franca and world Englishes, moving away from the resources that promote Anglo-Saxon values. Using authentic resources such literature, films, TV shows, and recorded conversation featuring non-native speakers can expose learners to English as a lingua franca communication and different genres. And as the last conclusion, we can consider that it's recommended to connect English as a lingua franca, world Englishes, and global English language teaching to be incorporated in the teaching programs as fast as possible, since participants' lack of exposure to this varieties, participants' lack of exposure to these varieties during their studies. And thanks for your attention.
The big conclusion after all these issues is to truly consider the incorporation of regardless the topic. If you say English as a lingua franca, what English is, global English is to include, let's say, to bring to the classes a more authentic sociocultural, let's say, view of English taking place in the world. Because even if we, for example, are using English in different contexts, we continue being like attached to native like standards and to native like dynamics. So this is kind of harmful because we are showing one side of the much. I think we have like 34 minutes for questions if we have so. So thank you so much.
Thank you to you. We have Carlos Carranza, who I guess he has a question. So Carlos, please go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed. First, I would like to say, well, send my greetings to the colleagues that had worked in this topic. It's a very useful topic, and I remember once I was really into this topic. I wanted to find out all the information I could about this topic. Global English is a fantastic topic. I remember that the first professor from Oxford University was David Crystal, the first one to say or to speak about global Englishes. And he said that maybe the future of the English is going to be shaped by the speakers, and that is, as a surprise, that the English speakers as a second language that they use it there is India. India is nowadays the most populated country in the world, and the one with the most English speakers. So my question is, do you really think English is going to be shaped by Indian English speakers? Well, people from India, and that is one. On the other hand, do you really think that is necessary to Americanize to be considered as an English speaker? Because if we can see the USA, and once in the USA you need to Americanize, you need to follow that process and give up on your roots. So do you think that now in 2024 we have to Americanize ourselves to be considered, well, maybe to be considered real English speakers? Thank you, colleagues.
Professor, thank you very much for the questions. I think Nicolás is the perfect person for talking about the first question because he was once in India, so he can talk about this issue. So Nicolás, go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon. So, okay, about the first question, if Indian English can shape the English itself, I think, okay, I think the Indian English has already been shaped, has already shaped the English that is being learned in India. There's some like controversies around this because even though that they already talk their own English, there are some standardized tests that like pose like a kind of barrier so that they could actually be considered Indian English. However, the implications of the English language that come from India or like the effects to other countries, it's another topic. Yeah, because when we talk about global Englishes, I think that it is giving recognition. Yeah, different countries, different Englishes, and not just one like leading the others how to speak. But the Indian English has already worked. Yeah. So if we hear, for instance, an Indian speaker speaking English, for us it's going to be very, very hard to understand at the beginning. But what if we were exposed to this variety of English since we were like starting our career? So at this point, it wasn't that difficult to understand. So I hope that that answers to the question.
And this is also kind of connected to the second question because, for instance, if we travel to the US, the question was connected to the issue of Americanizing And there is even a phenomenon that is McDonaldization, no? And linguistic imperialism. Should we talk like them to be able to be recognized as a legitimate speaker of English or user of English? In terms of English as a lingua franca, while English is a
...70 años de historia y de aporte a la academia de la provincia y el país. Con una identidad que nos define, nos conecta con nuestras raíces y nos motiva a trascender. Identidad que trasciende. Es un recordatorio de nuestro potencial colectivo. Es patria, técnica y cultura. Es crecer y construir un futuro más humano, más equitativo y más inclusivo para Manabí y Ecuador.
Universidad Técnica de Manabí, Santiago Quirós Fernández, Rector.
Nos encontramos aquí en el Centro de Investigación y Transferencia Tecnológica Los Pinos, que es un espacio de la Universidad Técnica de Manabí en el sector de Río Grande del Cantón Jhon. Aquí tenemos alrededor de 126 hectáreas, de las cuales unas 26 hectáreas todavía están en bosque primario donde no ha habido intervención del hombre.